After creating connections to different data sources in a Dataflow query, you may find you want to update the query later, whether that's because you want to change the source connection or add transformation steps to the connections you already set up. We don't need to create a new query within this Dataflow or even an entirely new Dataflow, but instead, we want to update our existing Dataflow queries. An example here for the testing tables Dataflow. For the forecast options entity name, we select the Edit Entity action. This brings us back into the query. If we want to update the source, we can see the step and the location of the file in the applied steps on the right. We could also promote the first row as headers by selecting Transform Table. Notice that this also updates the type of data in each of the columns. In this query, you can also explore the next steps for working with this data connection. For those of you with Power Premium accounts, you can look at the AI Insights option. That's going to give you some insight into the distribution of these numbers and these fields by leveraging some of the machine learning technology. We're in the Pro account, so we don't have access to the machine learning, but you can see where you can access it. Once you make these changes, you can hit Save and Close to apply them. This takes you back to the list of query entities within your Dataflow, and it indicates you've successfully updated this query. If the updates fail, you will receive a message indicating some of the potential issues. If you want to delete one of these entities within the Dataflow, the best way to do it is to go back in and edit the query again. We can see that there are two query entities within this Dataflow, so the queries list itself names both the entities within the Dataflow. If we want to remove the Dataflow types, we can select the query, then right-click on it, where we see the option to delete the query. You also see options to duplicate it, rename it, and change some of the other configuration options within the query. We don't want to keep these changes, so we'll select Cancel to take us back out to the Dataflow screen. Now we're back out at the list of query entities that roll up into the testing tables Dataflow. If we want to delete this entire Dataflow, we can close out of this particular Dataflow, which takes us back to the Dataflow main screen. Now we can select, say, Testing Tables, and click on the ellipsis option where we can select Delete as an option. You'll receive a confirmation asking you if you want to delete it. In this case, we just select Cancel, because we want to keep it. And there we see how to manage both the query entities and the entire Dataflow in case we want to remove or change the existing queries or Dataflows themselves. Utilizing Power Query Online, Applied Steps. Power Query Online is the web version of Power Query and Power BI Desktop, and also Excel. After connecting to data sources in Power BI Dataflows, we can then transform these queries into usable data tables. Power Query not only creates data connections, but also allows us to transform data in many different ways. Examples of these transformation functions include splitting column text, changing data types, adding new calculated columns, pivoting data tables, and drilling into query objects. Query folding is a Power BI query editor functionality that takes extraction and transformation steps and translates them into SQL commands to send back to the connection for compatible databases. Examples of query commands that can translate into query folding include merging or joining tables, appending tables, applying filters, adding new columns, renaming fields, and removing columns. In our Power BI Pro account, we already set up an API query for the Microsoft stock price data from the World Trading Data website. We can go back into edit the query by selecting the edit action. We can now access this connection to update it. From here, we can apply our transformation steps to this data connection. The list of the applied steps on the right shows the extract and transformation functions already applied to this query, both on our commands and also some of them automatically, such as replacing errors. If we want to remove one of these steps, we simply click on the X next to the step name. In this case, we want to actually remove the replace errors step because we're going to transform one of the earlier steps. So we start back at the source step. We see a query structure comprised of the Microsoft ticker name and the record object represented in this history row. We click into this record object. Record objects are not particularly useful on their own. To access the data within the record object, we click on this hyperlink. So the record object hyperlink stores the API query results returned from our request. Drilling into this object, we now see the date with the corresponding record object next to them that represents the data such as the prices and the volume on that particular day. We now see the expanded query structure and we want to convert this entire view to a table. To do so, we select Convert to Table at the top of the query editor. We now see a table object in our query. We can expand out each of these records in the value column by selecting the icon with the diverging arrows at the top of the column name. We don't want to include value in our column name, so we're going to uncheck this box and keep the rest of these fields selected. We hit OK. We now see the expanded data table. Notice that the data table is now readable to the human eye because we see it in the form of columns in a table object. To clean up the data table from this view, we're going to apply a few more simple transformation functions to improve the aesthetics of the table. Especially if you're sharing your data flow with other people who are not familiar with API queries or data itself. Renaming the columns into something more familiar will allow them to be more comfortable using the data itself. We're going to rename the first field date, the second field, opening price, and so when we name them a meaningful name for each of the fields. We can also change the data types for each of these fields so that we can use them later in our calculations visuals. For example, we want to see the date as a date data type and not a text data type. We select date from this list. We do the same for the prices, which we set to currency. For volume, we want to use a whole number because it represents the number of shares, which is a whole number. We can also rename our query to Microsoft stock prices so that if we add additional queries to this data flow, we can distinguish it from the others. Finally, we hit save and close. And we see the queries validating to confirm they work. We now see an updated query entity for the Microsoft stock prices within the Microsoft stock price data flow. There we have it. We see how the transformation functions can be applied to edit the query and make it into a usable data table. In the next video, the tutorial will be continued. Don't forget to subscribe. Thank you for watching.